This story takes place in a quiet town in Maine at the edge of the woods. Grace had grown up in this house, a large Victorian mansion that had seen better days. Her parents had recently retired and decided to take a vacation, leaving Grace to house sit. Now, you might think it's nice to have the place to yourself for a while, but this wasn't any ordinary house. It was a house with a past, one that Grace couldn't quite shake. You see, years ago, her twin sister Ellie had died in this very home, and Grace never quite recovered from that day. Grace arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the property as she walked up the gravel driveway. The house seemed to loom over her, its large windows dark and empty, like eyes watching her approach. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease, but she told herself it was just the memories, just the past creeping up on her. Once inside, Grace did her usual rounds, checking the windows, locking the doors, making sure everything was secure. It was a quiet town. Nothing ever really happened here. At least that's what she thought. Grace settled in for her first night alone in the house. The house, once filled with the sounds of family life, was now silent. Too silent. She tried to focus on reading, keeping her mind occupied, but every so often she found herself staring down the darkened hallway that led to her old bedroom, the room she hadn't stepped foot in for years. Directly across from it was Ellie's room, sealed shut, untouched since the day she died. As the night wore on, the stillness became oppressive. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond her sight. She turned up the TV, trying to drown out the creeping sense of dread. But it wasn't long before the sound of soft footsteps broke through the noise. They were quiet at first, barely noticeable, but distinct. The rhythmic creaking of the wooden floors echoed down the hallway, growing louder, closer. Grace sat frozen, the book slipping from her hands, her eyes fixed on the hallway. She called out, "Hello?" But no one answered. The footsteps stopped, right outside her door. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, but she told herself it was just the old house settling. She had to believe that. For a long while, there was only silence, and eventually Grace convinced herself that it had been nothing, just her mind playing tricks on her. But as she lay in bed later that night, the whispers started. Faint at first, like someone murmuring just beneath the sound of the wind. At first, Grace thought it was her mind drifting between dreams, but then she heard her name, softly, almost as if from another room. Grace. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't threatening, but it was unmistakable, and it wasn't her imagination. She sat up in bed, her pulse racing. It had to be her imagination, or maybe the wind. But deep down, Grace knew what she had heard. Ellie. She didn't want to admit it, but Ellie had always been with her ever since that day. Grace's memories of the accident were fuzzy, but she knew one thing for sure. Ellie had died trying to tell her something, and now she was back. By morning, Grace had convinced herself it was all a dream. After all, grief had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But as she moved through the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she passed a mirror, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, something that shouldn't be there. At first, it was just a fleeting shadow, a blur at the edge of her vision, but as the day wore on, the glimpses became clearer. In the corner of one mirror, she saw a figure standing just behind her. Grace spun around, but there was no one there. She checked the room, every corner, but it was empty. Her reflection looked normal, but just as she was about to turn away, she saw it again. A face so familiar and yet so distant, staring back at her from behind the glass. Ellie, her twin sister, standing there, her eyes hollow, her expression blank. But it wasn't the Ellie Grace remembered. This version of her sister was twisted, her face distorted with anger or fear. It was hard to tell, but she was there, and she was trying to say something. "Help me," Ellie's reflection whispered, but Grace's legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. Her mind raced back to the day of the accident. The mirror had shattered when Ellie died. How was it possible that she was still trapped in it? Grace turned away, trembling, and hurried down the stairs. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, Ellie's reflection followed her throughout the day. In every reflective surface, in every window, Ellie was there, watching, waiting. That night, as Grace tried to sleep, the unease she felt earlier hadn't gone away. She kept hearing the same strange noises, the footsteps, the whispers. But this time, there was something else, something outside. The sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway made her sit bolt upright in bed. She froze, straining to listen. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling the house. Grace moved to the window, peering through the curtains into the dark. And there, just at the edge of the tree line, she saw him. A man. He was standing perfectly still, just beyond the light of the street lamp, watching the house. Her breath caught in her throat. Who was he? Why was he just standing there? Grace grabbed her phone and called the police, her hands shaking as she spoke to the dispatcher. Minutes later, the distant sound of sirens approached, and the man disappeared into the shadows. Detective Harper arrived shortly after, taking Grace's statement. He listened carefully as she described the man and the strange events that had been happening over the last few days. Harper was concerned. He mentioned a series of disappearances that had been happening in the area. Women going missing from their homes, often after reporting strange occurrences. The police had no leads, no suspects, until now. Grace was the first one to report seeing the man. Harper promised he'd send patrols by the house for the next few nights, but Grace could tell from the look in his eyes that he was worried. Grace locked all the doors and windows that night, but it didn't help. The sense of dread had settled in her bones. She knew whoever had been watching her wasn't just some random stalker. He had a purpose, and somehow it was connected to Ellie's death. Determined to find out what was happening, Grace decided to face her past. She climbed into the attic where her family had stored all of Ellie's things after the accident. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and forgotten memories filled the room. And then she saw it, the mirror, the same mirror that had shattered on the day Ellie died. It was cracked, but still intact. As Grace wiped away the dust, she saw Ellie's reflection again, but this time it wasn't a ghostly figure in the background. Ellie was there, in the mirror, staring directly at Grace, her eyes full of desperation. "Help me," Ellie whispered again, her voice clearer now, and Grace realized something she hadn't before. Ellie wasn't trying to hurt her, she was trying to warn her. Flashes of that day rushed back to Grace, the argument they had, the way Ellie had looked at her just before the accident. Ellie had seen someone, and that someone had killed her. As Grace stared into the mirror, she saw more, flashes of memories, things she hadn't been able to remember until now. Ellie had discovered the stalker back then years ago. He had been watching them even then, but Ellie had confronted him, and that's when she died. The door to the house flew open with a loud bang, snapping Grace out of her trance. She heard the heavy footsteps, fast and deliberate, moving through the house toward her. He was here, the stalker, the man who had killed Ellie, and now he was coming for her. Grace ran, her heart pounding as she flew down the stairs. She could hear him behind her, his breath, his footsteps growing closer. Every door she tried was locked, every window shut tight. The house felt like a trap, a maze with no escape. In her panic, Grace found herself in the living room surrounded by mirrors, and in each one she saw Ellie standing there watching. But this time, Ellie wasn't just a reflection. She was there, in the room, her presence so strong it felt like the temperature dropped 20 degrees. As the man burst into the room, ready to strike, Ellie's spirit intervened. The mirrors began to crack, one by one, the air in the room turning icy cold. Objects flew off the shelves, and the man fell to his knees, clutching his head, screaming in agony. Grace watched in disbelief as the man crumbled, writhing on the floor. Ellie's reflection flickered in and out of the mirrors, her eyes filled with anger and sorrow. And then, in a final act of vengeance, she disappeared. The police arrived minutes later, Detective Harper leading the way. The man was arrested, and the truth about Ellie's death finally came to light. Grace left the house the next day, shaken but alive. The man who had stalked her for years was finally caught, and Ellie's spirit, well, she was finally at peace. Or so Grace hoped. But the house? The house will always carry the weight of the past. The shadows of what happened there linger in every corner, every reflection. Grace never returned, and neither did anyone else. The house now stands empty, its windows dark, its secrets locked away. But the shadows, they'll always remain. Thanks for listening to this chilling tale. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Dr. Scary Tales. And remember, the past has a way of coming back, sometimes when you least expect it. Until next time, stay safe and sleep well.